American history and culture. Our guests, Neil Howe and William Strauss, are the authors of Generations, The History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069. The authors sort Americans into 18 generations. They then distinguish among idealist, reactive, civic, and adaptive groups, and how these characteristics can be used to explain history and to predict cultural trends. Neil Howe and William Strauss join us now to explain their book and their vision of the future.
Age labeled as bad by considered them a little bit wild and uneducated. They were tarred a bit by the 1920s and some of the bad people that came out of that decade. And after the Great Depression, when they were the one age group in midlife that never received any subsidy from the government, they settled into a rather reclusive old age, but an old age in which, in the post-war America, they re-strengthened the American family. They paid back the national debt, and slowed down the culture, and gave generously to the younger generations that came behind them.
Bill Strauss, what does GI stand for?
Well, the GI generation were the first GI Joes, as the missionary General Marshall described them, the best damn kids in the world from World War II. And we remember them swarming ashore on the beaches at Iwo Jima and Normandy. America first met them with Charles Lindbergh and Walt Disney and the first Boy and Girl Scouts that America ever had. These were team players and good kids, smart kids, a little unlike the lost generation bad kids of just a couple of decades before. They felt their major brush with history and with heroism when young, and coming out of the war they felt a huge generational slingshot which energized them and the country. They have since then held the presidency of the United States longer than any other generation in our history, from Presidents Kennedy through Bush. And they also, upon entering elderhood, found themselves attacked by the boom generation and have since then separated into a senior citizen community. We never before used the term senior citizen widely until we associated that kind of busy, optimistic, upbeat atmosphere with this generation in elderhood. And of course, over the past 2 decades, America has funneled an enormous amount of resources into health care and retirement subsidies for this generation, enormously beyond what the lost generation knew, and far beyond what Neil and I expect will be available for other generations.
Let me just add here that an important theme of our book is how certain personality traits follow a generation from youth to old age. One of the characteristics of the GIs back in the 1930s and 1940s, from somewhere over the rainbow and accentuate the positive, is the incredible confidence about the future and a passion to be busy, to be building, and to be constructive.
What about the silent generation, 1925 to 1942? That's when people were born.
Well, the silent generation were the ones who refined and added nuance to what the GIs were doing, and they too felt the pressure of what the initials GI stand for, which is general issue, the regularity of the society. They came of age in a world that they felt was overly conformist, and set about on a life mission of adding nuance and complexity and other directedness and cultural pluralism to a society that, when young, felt oversimple to them. They fused the white and Afro-American cultures to produce rock and roll. They were the leading early proponents of the civil rights movements, the nonviolent movements. Virtually all the prominent African-American leaders of the civil rights movement, from the first children who desegregated the schools at Little Rock up through the Jesse Jacksons and Douglas Wilders of today, have been members of the silent generation. But they had the misfortune to reach midlife, all the silent generation did, at a time when the consciousness revolution of the 1960s hit. And this was when they were the guardians of the family, and it splintered families on their watch. And it resulted in a substantial weakening of the protection afforded to the young. And then in the past couple of decades, we've seen the silent generation be the dominant decade in the dominant generation in the Congress. This has been a time when public confidence in the ability of the Congress to actually solve the nation's problems has eroded. And they are 0 for 6 in runs for the presidency. They could very well be the first generation never to elect a president.
Neil, boom.
The boom generation, born 1943 to 1960, first arrived as the victory babies of World War II. They were also the first Dr. Spock babies who told parents to raise their children a bit more indulgently, with a bit more relaxed style of nurture, and give them what they want materially so these kids could think about deeper values and deeper meaning. The boomers, the 43 cohort, those born in 43, we later met during the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1965. This was the same college class. They went on to add passion and violence to the protest movements of the 60s. During the 1970s, when everyone expected the boomers to become a great new political force in American politics, they instead entered a political remission. By 1980, they had become the yuppie, and they concentrated on a certain cultural perfectionism. Rather than involving themselves with politics, they detached themselves from institutional life, from having families, from having steady jobs. Today, they're beginning to enter midlife, and they're beginning to show a puritanical streak. The same generation that 20 years ago trusted no one over 30 is today beginning to police the morals of everyone under 30. Now, this is a pattern, as with all these generations, that we see in every previous generation of this type. And we expect to see a lot more of that sterner tone from the boomers as they move into their 50s.
Both of you are boomers, right?
That's right.
That's right. I was born in 1947 and Neil in 1951. Now, you see, we define the boom generation differently from demographers. You often hear reference to the years 1946 through 1964 as mapping the baby boom. We think that's an interesting statement about the fertility patterns of American parents during that time, but it doesn't tell you about the personality of the generation. The most important thing to look for in defining a generation is how the members of that generation define themselves. And if you ask people who were born between 1943 and 45 whether they feel like boomers, whether they've always felt like it, generally they'll say absolutely. Similarly, you ask members of what we call the 13th generation, born from 61 through 64, whether they are boomers, and they say, please, God help me, no.
And those, you also refer to them as 13ers?
The 13th generation in American history, dating back to Benjamin Franklin. These are the 13th to know the American nation and flag. They also are faced with a real hard luck life cycle reminiscent of what the old lost generation knew. And the number 13 is a good reflection of that. It's also a slippery label, something that the kids themselves like because they're tired of being criticized by elders, being told that they're part of a bust, a baby bust group that is disappointing when compared with the boom.
One thing we talk about with the 13th generation is how attitudes toward children changed very dramatically in the early 1960s and through the 1970s. The 13th generation are the first babies people took pills not to have. And as the 1960s went on, we saw a new kind of movie come into national popularity, the Rosemary's Baby, the Exorcist type film, which depicted the child as devil, as bad, mean, and selfish. Many of the 13ers today in their late 20s remember that period, and their sense of identity, their sense of self, has in some ways been permanently shaped by that. Today, by contrast, since the early 1980s, we've had a whole new batch of cuddly baby movies. Today, with the emergence of yet a new generation, babies are to be protected. We see baby on board bumper stickers everywhere, and people think that children must be given a better national mission and must be given structure as children.
Okay.
And we call them the millennial generation.
The ones that were born in between 1982 and the year 2003.
Right.
Kids who are presently in 3rd grade and younger.
It's when we saw a sudden change in people's attitudes toward divorce, toward family, towards structure and discipline in schools, a rethinking of many of the assumptions and the educational experiments that went wrong that many people in retrospect believe went wrong during the 1970s.
There is available for anyone who wants to read it, and I'm going to bring it up here, wide swings in the way people feel about your book, as you well know, from reviewers to the jacket. One of the strongest statements made on the jacket about this book comes from Senator Albert Gore, Jr. Before I read it, why Senator Gore? Why did you pick him?
Well, he asked to see an early manuscript of the book a couple of years ago, and we passed it to him, and he felt that this book told the story of history in a way that people his age could connect with, unlike anything else that he had encountered.
I'm not so sure this is an easy answer. How would he know, for instance, that you were doing this book? Is this something that everybody around town has known for a while?
No, because he appeared on stage with the Capitol Steps, and I chatted with him about it.
Okay.
Yeah, he actually has a wonderful singing voice, too, as well as being a good judge of books.
Well, I bring him up because his statement is very strong. Generations, this is the name of your book, is the most stimulating book on American history I have ever read. Does that surprise you?
Well, it pleases us. We hope it doesn't surprise us too much. We try to bring history alive and tell it from the vantage point that people actually lived it. Most historians don't tell history that way.
He says, as Thomas Kuhn predicted in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Who is Thomas Kuhn?
Well, he was an historian of the history of science who wrote that disciplines are periodically transformed by sudden paradigm shifts. For instance, when Copernicus suggested that that explaining planets as revolving around the sun could simplify and improve explanations of how the universe worked.